Close your eyes for a second and picture this. It's 252 million years ago. The world doesn't look anything like the one you know. There's one giant supercontinent called Pangaea, surrounded by a single vast ocean. The forests are dense and strange, full of plants that no human eye has ever seen. Enormous reptiles wander through undergrowth beside creatures that look like a halfway point between lizard and mammal. The seas are absolutely teeming with life. Coral reefs stretch for hundreds of miles. Strange armoured fish dart between colonies of creatures so alien they don't even have modern names that quite fit them. Trilobites crawl across the seafloor. Cephalopods jet through warm, shallow water. The ocean is so full of life it almost seems impossible that anything could threaten it. And then something happens. Actually, several things happen. And what follows is the single worst catastrophe in the entire history of life on this planet. Not the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, not the ice ages that nearly froze the world. This one. The one that most people have never even heard of. In a geological blink, roughly 96% of all marine species and around 70% of all land species are gone, forever. Wiped out so completely that the planet's food webs essentially collapse. The oceans, those thriving, impossibly complex systems that took hundreds of millions of years to build, go nearly silent. The land goes quiet too. Scientists call it the End-Permian mass extinction. Some call it simply the Great Dying. And 252 million years later, we still cannot fully explain exactly how it happened. That's not a small admission. We have sent probes to the edge of the solar system. We have mapped the human genome. We have decoded the physics of black holes. And yet this event, this almost total silencing of life on our own planet, still doesn't have a complete agreed-upon explanation. The evidence points in multiple directions at once, and every time researchers think they've solved it, another piece of data throws a wrench into the theory. Was it the most violent volcanic event in the last 500 million years, pumping unimaginable amounts of carbon into the atmosphere? Was it runaway climate change that cooked the planet from the inside out? Was it the oceans suffocating, losing their oxygen so completely they turned toxic? Was it acid dissolving the shells and bones of anything that tried to survive? Was it poison raining down from the sky? Or was it all of those things at once, hitting a world that had no time to recover between blows? This video is a detective story. We're going to go through the evidence, the timeline, the suspects, and the moments where the science still breaks down and the arguments still haven't been settled. Because understanding what nearly ended everything on Earth isn't just a history lesson, it's a warning. It tells us something profound about how fragile the systems that support life actually are, and how quickly those systems can flip from thriving to collapse. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and every time I do it's Berlin at breakfast, someone in the Philippines at 3 a.m, a night shift worker in Texas, all watching the same ancient disaster unfold from completely different corners of the same planet that almost lost everything 252 million years ago. So let's go back, way back, to a world that was extraordinary, that was full, that was alive. Right before it almost wasn't. To understand how something dies, you first have to understand how it lived. So let's actually go there. Let's walk around in the late Permian world, because it was genuinely one of the most remarkable moments in the entire history of life on Earth, and also, quietly, one of the most precarious. Even before anything went wrong, there were fault lines running through this world that most of the creatures living in it had no way of knowing about. Start with the geography, because the geography explains almost everything. By 252 million years ago, the slow drift of tectonic plates had done something that had never happened before in quite the same way, and would never happen again. Every major landmass on Earth had collided and fused into a single supercontinent, Pangaea. One enormous, continuous piece of land stretching almost from pole to pole, surrounded by a single global ocean called Panthalassa. If you could see it from space, it would look less like a planet with continents, and more like a planet with one continent and a lot of water. Now, that sounds impressive, and in some ways, it was. But for life, this arrangement created some serious structural problems. Think about what a supercontinent actually means for climate. Coastlines matter enormously. They're where ocean moisture makes landfall, where rainfall is most reliable, where ecosystems can be dense and layered and interconnected. A supercontinent the size of Pangaea had a staggering amount of interior. Thousands of miles of continental interior, locked away from any coastal influence, baking under the sun with no ocean breeze to moderate the temperature, and precious little rainfall to keep things alive. Massive arid belts ran through the heart of Pangaea. There were places in the interior where the climate was probably as harsh as anything on Earth today, perhaps harsher. Seasonal extremes were brutal. A world with one landmass gets one monsoon system essentially, and the creatures unlucky enough to live far from the fringes of that system lived in something close to permanent semi-desert. This matters for what comes later. Keep it in your mind. And yet, despite all of that, life in the late Permian was astonishing. On land, the dominant animals weren't dinosaurs. Dinosaurs hadn't evolved yet. The creatures ruling the Permian landscape were the synapsids, a group so successful and so diverse that calling them by one name almost does them a disservice. Some were small and nimble, some were enormous. The dicynodonts, stocky plant-eaters with a beak like a turtle and two tusks jutting from their upper jaw, were among the most successful land vertebrates in Earth's history. The gorgonopsians were hunters, some the size of bears, with blade-like teeth and a speed and aggression that made them the apex predators of their world. And winding between all of them were the early relatives of reptiles, smaller, faster evolving, beginning to experiment with body plans that would eventually lead to lizards, crocodilians, and eventually dinosaurs, though none of them knew that. The insect world alone would have stunned you. Diversity we can barely imagine from the fossil record. Seed ferns filled ecological niches that flowering plants wouldn't claim for another 100 million years. Glossopteris forests dominated the southern reaches of Pangaea, vast and dense, important enough that their fossils would eventually help Alfred Wegener argue correctly that the southern continents were once joined together. In the oceans, the picture was even more spectacular and even more structurally complicated. Panthalassa was enormous, so enormous that ocean circulation patterns were nothing like what we have today. The seas were warm, probably warmer than today's oceans across much of their extent, and they were full. Coral-like reefs built by organisms called rugose, and tabulate corals stretched along the shallow shelves of Pangaea's coastline. Ammonoids, those beautiful coiled cephalopods that look a little like the nautilus you might have seen in a museum, were everywhere, jetting through the water column with remarkable efficiency. Brachiopods carpeted the seafloor in numbers that are genuinely difficult to conceptualize. Echinoderms, foraminifera, bryozoans, ancient fish, all threading through one of the most complex ecological webs the planet had ever produced. And yes, trilobites, still there at the very end. A lineage that had already survived 3 previous mass extinctions over the course of 270 million years. By the late Permian they were reduced, diminished, clinging on, mostly bottom dwellers on the shallow continental shelves, but still there, still alive, ancient survivors of a world so old it barely connects to anything recognizable. Here's what's important to understand about all of this abundance. It was real, but it wasn't invulnerable. Some paleontologists have started to ask a question that sounds almost uncomfortable. Was the biosphere already under stress before the main blow landed? Because the geographic reality of Pangaea had already created winners and losers. Life was concentrated along coastal fringes and shallow marine shelves. The interior was already a difficult marginal place for most species. Oxygen levels in some parts of the deep ocean may have already been declining through the late Permian. Some reef systems show signs of partial stress in the fossil record even before the boundary event. The continental interiors were already under climatic pressure from extreme seasonality and aridity. This was a world that had produced extraordinary diversity, yes, but it had done so in a geographic configuration that left enormous portions of its landmass underserved, that concentrated marine life in a narrow band of coastal shallows, and that had limited redundancy built into its systems. In other words, if something hit this world hard enough, there weren't many places left to hide. And something was about to hit it very, very hard. So here's the problem. The world I just described to you, the synapsids, the brachiopod-carpeted seafloor, the vast Glossopteris forests, the last trilobites clinging to their shallow shelves, all of it is gone. Not just gone the way a civilization goes, leaving ruins you can walk through. Gone the way a fire goes through paper. What's left is rock, compressed, folded, chemically altered rock that has spent 252 million years being buried and uplifted and eroded and buried again. And somehow, from that, scientists have managed to reconstruct one of the most detailed crime scenes in the history of this planet. How they do it is worth understanding, because the evidence isn't just interesting background, it's the whole argument. Every claim you're going to hear for the rest of this video about timelines, causes, kill mechanisms, competing theories, every single one of them rests on a specific type of physical evidence pulled from the ground at specific locations around the world. If you understand the evidence, you understand why the debate is still alive. Start with the most fundamental tool, the rock itself. Sedimentary rock layers are time made physical. Sediment accumulates in layers, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top, and in the right environment that process is continuous and predictable enough that you can read it like pages of a book. At dozens of locations around the world, geologists have found sequences of rock that span the Permian-Triassic boundary. That is, they contain rock from just before the extinction, through the event itself, and into the aftermath. These sections are invaluable. They let you watch the extinction happen in slow motion, layer by layer, if your dating resolution is good enough. And increasingly, it is. The boundary itself is globally recognizable, which is one of the remarkable things about it. In many sections, there's a distinct shift, sometimes abrupt, sometimes accompanied by a thin clay layer, where the fossil record changes dramatically. Below the line, Permian fauna. Above it, almost nothing. Then, gradually, a new and much simpler set of organisms beginning to colonize what was left of the world. That boundary layer, wherever it appears, tends to show carbon isotope anomalies, traces of volcanic ash, and changes in the types of organic compounds preserved in the rock. It's not quite as dramatic as the iridium layer that marks the dinosaur-killing impact 66 million years ago, but it's real, and it's consistent across multiple continents and ocean basins. Carbon isotopes are particularly important here. Carbon comes in different weights, different isotopes, and living things preferentially use the lighter variety. When you suddenly dump massive amounts of isotopically light carbon into the atmosphere and oceans, that signal gets locked into carbonate rocks and organic material forming at the time. The Permian-Triassic boundary shows one of the largest and most abrupt carbon isotope excursions in the entire geological record. Something, and figuring out exactly what that something was is one of the central controversies of the field, injected an enormous pulse of carbon into the Earth system right at the moment life started dying. That signal shows up in rock sections from China to Italy to Greenland to Iran. Is one of the most consistent pieces of evidence in the entire dataset. Then there's the fossil record itself, which is both the most powerful evidence and the most complicated to interpret. When scientists say 96% of marine species went extinct, that number comes from comparing fossil assemblages below the boundary with those above it. You count the genera and species present in late Permian rocks, you count what survives into the earliest Triassic, and you calculate the loss. That's the method. But here's the caveat. And it's an important one. The fossil record is not a complete catalogue of ancient life. It's a sample. Species with hard shells or bones fossilize more readily than soft-bodied organisms. Shallow marine environments preserve better than deep water. Some regions of the world simply haven't been studied yet. So the 96% figure is a statistical estimate based on what we can actually find, calibrated against known preservation biases, is probably in the right range. But it's not a precise count. Keep that in mind whenever you hear the number stated as if it were a census result. Dating how fast all of this happened is where the field has gotten genuinely exciting in recent decades. Radiometric dating, particularly uranium-lead dating of tiny zircon crystals found in volcanic ash beds, has transformed our resolution of the Permian-Triassic boundary from rough estimates to precise timescales. Volcanic eruptions conveniently deposit ash layers that contain zircons, crystals which lock in radioactive uranium at the moment they form. Measuring the decay of that uranium into lead tells you, with remarkable precision, when the crystal formed, and therefore when the ash fell. Threading multiple dated ash layers through a boundary section lets you build a timeline of extraordinary precision. Current estimates suggest the main pulse of marine extinction happened within somewhere between 60,000 and a few 100,000 years, a blink of an eye in geological terms, though the debate over exactly how compressed that window was continues to generate serious scientific argument. Some researchers think it was even faster. That question, was this a single catastrophic pulse or a longer drawn-out collapse, turns out to matter enormously for identifying the cause, which is why you'll hear it come up again later. The field localities that have shaped everything we know are scattered across the world, and each one contributes something different. The Meishan section in South China has become the global reference point for the boundary. It was where the formal boundary marker was established, and its exceptionally complete record has been dated and redated more precisely than almost any other section on Earth. Sections in Iran and Italy provide cross-checks from the ancient Tethys Sea, the ocean that separated the northern and southern edges of Pangaea. Siberian localities connect the extinction timeline to the volcanic record from the Siberian traps. Antarctic sections preserve evidence from Gondwana's far southern ecosystems, giving a sense of whether the extinction hit all latitudes simultaneously or swept across the planet in waves. What emerges from all of these locations when you put them together is not a clean story. It's a picture full of regional variations, conflicting signals, and interpretive gaps. Some sections suggest the extinction was geologically instantaneous. Others suggest a more prolonged decline. Some show the carbon isotope shift happening right at the fossil boundary. Others show it slightly before. That's not a failure of the science. That's the science doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Because what it's telling you is that the Permian-Triassic extinction was almost certainly not a single event with a single cause. It was something more complicated, more layered, more difficult to explain. And that's why, 252 million years later, the debate is still open. So once you have the rocks, the ash layers, the isotope curves, and the fossils laid out in front of you, the next question is obvious. Did the world die in a single, catastrophic sucker punch? Or was it a brutal series of hits that finally pushed the biosphere over the edge? The answer depends on how closely you can zoom in on time. At the scale of hundreds of millions of years, the Permian-Triassic extinction looks like a vertical cliff. One moment, complex ecosystems with coral-like reefs, forests, and diverse predators. The next moment, a wasteland dominated by a handful of disaster-tolerant species. If your ruler is coarse enough, you'd be tempted to call it instantaneous. But as geochronology and stratigraphy have gotten better, that cliff has started to resolve into steps. Not a gentle slope, this was still a catastrophe, but a sequence. Late Permian disturbances, a boundary crisis, and then a long drawn-out series of early Triassic aftershocks. Start in the late Permian, a few million years before the formal boundary. In marine rocks, especially from the Tethys region, you see evidence that ecosystems were already under stress. Reef builders, sponges and calcareous algae that had dominated shallow seas, begin to decline. Some groups of brachiopods and fusulinid foraminifera show reduced diversity and more restricted ranges. On land, the Glossopteris-dominated swamp forests of Gondwana start to fragment and disappear in some basins before the main extinction peak. This isn't a mass die-off yet. Think of it as the background soundtrack getting ominous. More local extinctions, more ecological turnover, more signs that environments are becoming less stable. Sedimentary evidence points to increased aridity in some continental interiors, more variable river systems, more dust. Chemical proxies suggest that oxygen levels in some parts of the ocean were already dropping, at least intermittently. Then, closer to the boundary, within the last few 100,000 years of the Permian, things accelerate. In several well-studied Chinese sections, fossil diversity begins to decline more steeply, even before the sharp extinction horizon. Some researchers have identified what they call a prelude extinction pulse, a significant loss of species that predates the main crash by tens to hundreds of thousands of years. It's not as severe as what comes later, but it's noticeable. Certain groups of ammonoids, conodonts, and benthic invertebrates thin out or vanish from the record. If you zoom in even further using high-precision zircon dating and very detailed sampling, a pattern starts to emerge that many scientists now favour: multiple pulses, at least two, possibly more, clustered around the boundary. The biggest marine die-off, the one that wipes out that famous approximately 96% of species, appears to occur in a geologically short window that might be as brief as 60,000 years, or as long as a few 100,000, depending on which dataset you believe. Within that window, some sections even hint at subpulses, rapid downs and brief partial stabilizations. This is where the limits of the rock record become painfully obvious. A handful of centimetres of sediment can represent tens of thousands of years. If sedimentation paused or erosion removed a layer, you might be missing entire episodes. If the rock is condensed, lots of time squeezed into a thin package, even the fastest catastrophe will look smeared out. So when you hear debates about single pulse versus multiple pulses, keep in mind everyone is staring at the same imperfect tape, trying to figure out where the jump cuts are. On land, the timing is even messier. In some terrestrial basins, the collapse of vertebrate diversity seems to line up closely with the marine extinction. In others, there are hints that land ecosystems began unraveling earlier, with the disappearance of forest ecosystems and a shift toward more open, drought-resistant vegetation. Palynology, the study of pollen and spores, shows an abrupt turnover at or near the boundary in many places, with complex gymnosperm-dominated floras giving way to assemblages dominated by ferns and simple, opportunistic plants. But the exact moment of that flip can differ from basin to basin. Add to that the fact that terrestrial sedimentation is often discontinuous. Rivers migrate, floodplains erode, lakes come and go, and you get a timeline that's more patchwork than continuous film. Still, when you stitch the best records together, you get a rough sequence. First, in the late Permian, increasing environmental instability, more climate swings, regional drying, hints of marine oxygen stress, signs that some forests and shallow marine communities are already in trouble. Then, a sharp, globally recognizable crisis at the boundary. A massive carbon isotope excursion, widespread sedimentary changes, and a sudden crash in marine and terrestrial diversity. This is the main kill phase. Finally, in the early Triassic, instead of a clean rebound, you get something else. A long, stuttering recovery plagued by repeated setbacks. Diversity stays low. Ecosystems remain simple and dominated by a few hardy survivors. Geochemical signals suggest that environmental stress, particularly in the oceans, persists for millions of years. Who goes down first in this sequence, and who clings on, turns out to be a crucial clue. Reef communities are among the earliest and hardest hit. The elaborate three-dimensional structures built by late Permian reef organisms disappear and are replaced by what geologists call disaster faunas, microbial mats, and simple, opportunistic organisms that colonize newly vacant seafloor. Complex filter-feeding communities in shallow marine environments suffer heavy losses very quickly around the boundary. Benthic organisms that need stable, oxygen-rich seafloor conditions, many brachiopods, echinoderms, and certain mollusks, fare badly. Groups with high metabolic demands and complex life cycles tend to crash earlier and more thoroughly. In contrast, some things hang on, at least for a while. Certain burrowing invertebrates, some small generalist bivalves, and microbial communities survive the initial kill phases and even thrive in the aftermath. In the vertebrate world, small, generalist predators and scavengers tend to fare better than large specialized ones. On land, some synapsids and early archosaur relatives make it through, though their ecosystems are radically simplified. This selectivity matters. If the extinction had been truly random, like flipping a table of biodiversity and watching everything spill equally, you'd reach for very different explanations. Instead, the pattern points towards specific kill mechanisms that target particular ecological and physiological vulnerabilities. That brings us to an important conceptual split. Kill mechanisms versus recovery blockers. Kill mechanisms are the things that do the immediate damage during the main crisis. Rapid warming, ocean acidification, severe anoxia, toxic gas releases, habitat loss, maybe even impacts. These are the blows that take a rich, complex biosphere and cut it down in a geologic instant. Recovery blockers are what come afterward, the conditions that prevent life from bouncing back the way it usually does after a big extinction. Because mass extinctions aren't that rare in Earth's history. In many of them, you see a fairly rapid evolutionary rebound. New groups radiate to fill empty niches. Ecosystem complexity increases again. After the Permian-Triassic boundary, that doesn't really happen, not quickly. The early Triassic is sometimes described as a prolonged dead zone. Marine diversity stays low for 3 to 5 million years. Reef ecosystems, in particular, fail to re-establish anything like their former complexity. On land, communities remain dominated by a few hardy plants and disaster-adapted animals. Sedimentary evidence suggests repeated episodes of ocean anoxia and extreme climate swings during this entire period. Whatever killed most of life at the boundary didn't just walk away, It left the planet in a state where the usual processes of ecological and evolutionary recovery were repeatedly knocked back. Imagine trying to rebuild a city after a bombing, but every few decades another smaller bomb goes off in the same place. You get a city, eventually. The Middle Triassic does show real recovery, but the process is halting and weird. So when scientists try to match causes to the timeline, they're asking two related questions. What mechanism can deliver a rapid, severe global kill phase that matches the main boundary crisis? And what mechanism, or sequence of mechanisms, can keep messing with the climate, the oceans, and the carbon cycle for millions of years afterward, preventing a normal recovery? Some candidates are better at one of these jobs than the other. A gigantic meteor impact, for example, is excellent at delivering a sudden, horrific kill pulse. That's part of why it's the leading explanation for the End Cretaceous extinction. But by itself, it's not as good at generating long-term, pulsing environmental stress that lasts millions of years, unless it triggers secondary effects. On the flip side, gradual tectonic changes or slow climate trends can create background stress and long-term instability. But they struggle to explain a sharp, globally synchronized collapse compressed into tens of thousands of years. The emerging consensus for the Permian-Triassic interval is that you probably need both. Something, or several things, that deliver sudden punches, layered on top of a deep, ongoing reorganization of the Earth system that keeps the patient from getting back up. In the next sections, we're going to walk through the prime suspects. We'll look at the Siberian traps, one of the largest volcanic provinces the planet has ever produced, and see how their timing lines up with the extinction pulses. We'll trace how massive CO2 emissions could drive runaway warming, drought, and ocean stagnation. We'll follow the oceans as they lose their oxygen, flirt with toxic chemistry, and turn into what some researchers call purple oceans. We'll see how acidified seas might have dissolved shells and wrecked carbonate-producing ecosystems. We'll even examine the possibility that exotic gases and halogens from deep in the Earth damaged the ozone layer and bathed the surface in increased UV radiation. And because no murder mystery is complete without at least considering the cliché, we'll examine the impact hypothesis. Was there a space rock involved at all, or is that one disaster too many? The key through all of this will be timing. Which suspects were active in the late Permian lead-up? Which can deliver a kill mechanism right at the boundary? Which can plausibly keep the early Triassic locked in a state of prolonged stress? Because it's one thing to have a list of terrible things that can happen to a planet. It's another thing to make them line up, in order, with the death of almost everything. If you're looking for a prime suspect that can hit hard, hit globally, and keep hitting for millions of years, you don't start with a volcano. You start with a continent-sized volcano factory. In northern Siberia today, there's a region roughly the size of Western Europe that, at first glance, doesn't look like much. A plateau, step-like hills, river-cut canyons. To a geologist, though, it's one of the most terrifying crime scenes on Earth, the Siberian traps. Traps comes from the Swedish word trappa, stairs. From the air, the landscape is a series of giant steps, built from layer upon layer of ancient lava flows. Those steps are the frozen remains of an eruption, or more accurately an eruptive episode, that dwarfs anything humans have ever witnessed. This is what geologists call a large igneous province, or LIP. Normal volcanism is like a city's worth of streetlights flickering on and off. The Siberian traps is the entire power grid shorting out at once. A large igneous province isn't a single mountain venting occasionally. It's an enormous volume of magma erupting through fissures and cracks across a region thousands of kilometers wide. Instead of conical volcanoes, picture curtains of fire, hundreds of kilometers long, lava pouring out not for days or weeks, but in pulses that can last thousands of years each, stacked into a total eruptive episode that may span 1,000,000 years or more. By the time the Siberian traps cooled, they had produced on the order of a few million cubic kilometers of basalt, enough to bury an area the size of the continental United States under more than a kilometer of lava. If you're trying to ruin a planet, that's a good start. But here's where the story gets interesting, because most life on Earth did not die by being buried in lava. Even in Siberia, huge regions would have escaped direct inundation. The rest of the world, Pangaea's vast interiors, the Tethys Ocean, the southern continents, never saw a single drop of that basalt. So if the Siberian traps really are our prime suspect, The killing mechanism has to be mostly indirect. Volcanism doesn't just build rocks, it rewires the atmosphere and the oceans. When basaltic magma erupts at this scale, it releases staggering quantities of gases, primarily carbon dioxide, CO2, and water vapor, but also sulfur dioxide, SO2, halogens like chlorine and fluorine, and a whole suite of trace metals and volatiles. Each of those comes with its own way of making life miserable. CO2 is the slow-acting weapon. Pump enough of it into the atmosphere and you thicken the greenhouse blanket around the planet. Incoming sunlight still reaches the surface, but more of the outgoing infrared radiation gets trapped. Temperatures rise, ice melts, weather patterns shift, evaporation increases, which can amplify both droughts and extreme rainfall. At modern emission rates, we worry, justifiably, about a few degrees of warming over centuries. A large igneous province takes that concept and runs it through an amplifier. Estimates for the total CO2 emitted by the Siberian traps range up to tens of thousands of gigatons. Not all at once, and not with perfect agreement between studies, but enough that, if even a fraction accumulated in the atmosphere, it could drive global temperatures up by 5, 8, maybe more than 10 degrees Celsius over geologic short timescales. You don't need molten rock at your doorstep for that to kill you. Change the temperature and the hydrological cycle fast enough, and ecosystems built for narrow climatic windows start to unravel. Sulfur dioxide is a different kind of weapon. It acts fast. When SO2 reaches the stratosphere, it can form sulfate aerosols, tiny reflective particles that bounce sunlight back into space. This cools the surface, temporarily. Individual large eruptions we know from history, like Tambora in 1815, produced just enough SO2 to knock global temperatures down for a year or two. The result? The year without a summer, crop failures, famines. Scale that up to the Siberian traps, and you can imagine a planet caught in a vicious oscillation. Each major eruptive pulse injects SO2, causing brief volcanic winters. Those aerosols settle out in a few years to decades, revealing an atmosphere now slightly richer in CO2. The underlying trend is warming, but it's punctuated by short, sharp, cold snaps. For living things, that combination, long-term warming plus extreme short-term climate whiplash, is worse than either alone. You don't get time to adapt. You get ambushed repeatedly. And both CO2 and SO2 have another trick: acid. CO2 dissolves in water to form carbonic acid. Sulfur dioxide can become sulfuric acid. When these gases dissolve in rain, you get acid rain, falling across continents and oceans far from any eruption. Acid rain leaches nutrients and toxic metals out of soils and rocks. It can strip leaves from plants, damage delicate freshwater ecosystems, and contribute to the chemical changes that make oceans more corrosive to shells and skeletons. A thread will follow in detail later. So if you dump enough volcanic gases into the atmosphere, you don't just warm the planet. You stress plants with drought and heat, then hit them with acid rain. You push oceans toward lower pH and lower oxygen. You rearrange climates on a continental scale, all without ever having to engulf a forest in lava. The big question is, did the Siberian traps do all of this at the right time? This is where high-precision dating comes in. Using uranium-lead ages from tiny zircon crystals in volcanic ash layers, geochronologists have pinned down the main phase of Siberian traps activity to roughly the same interval as the End-Permian extinction. Many studies place the onset of the most voluminous eruptions within a couple 100,000 years of the extinction horizon. Some argue that the real firestorm, the highest eruption rates, overlaps almost exactly with the sharpest decline in fossil diversity and the main carbon isotope excursion. In other words, when the rock record shows the biosphere nosediving, the Siberian traps appear to be in full furious operation. But overlaps in geology is a slippery word. Are we talking about perfect simultaneity, eruptions kicking off and species dropping dead in lockstep? Or did life start to struggle first, with volcanism escalating into a final blow? Different data sets and different interpretations of the same data give slightly different answers. Some sections suggest a lead-up of environmental stress, perhaps early volcanic pulses or other tectonic factors, followed by a massive intensification. Others see the main kill phase as tightly coupled to peak volcanism. This is one of the core uncertainties. Most researchers now agree that the Siberian traps are involved. The scale, the timing, the geochemical fingerprints in the rocks all point in that direction. But whether they were the lone gunman or just the biggest player in a more complicated conspiracy is still debated. And even within the volcanic story, there's another twist. The Siberian traps weren't just about lava pouring out on the surface. A huge amount of the real mischief may have happened underground. As the mantle plume that fed the traps rose beneath Siberia, it encountered a thick pile of sedimentary rocks, coal beds, organic-rich shales, carbonates loaded with limestone and dolomite, evaporites containing salts and sulfates. Instead of simply bursting out at the surface, a lot of the magma pushed sideways, forcing its way into these older layers. These underground intrusions, sills and dikes, cook the surrounding rocks at high temperatures. This is intrusive volcanism, and for the climate it's potentially even more dangerous than what you see on the surface. Bake a coal seam with hot magma, and you don't just melt rock, you distill it. You drive off huge amounts of methane and CO2, heat an organic-rich shale, and you can release complex hydrocarbons and additional greenhouse gases, inject magma into carbonates, and you liberate CO2 on a vast scale. Hit sulfate-rich evaporites, and you may release sulfur-bearing gases far beyond what the magma alone carries. In other words, the Siberian traps might not just be the emissions from the magma itself. They might be a gigantic, messy combustion experiment in which the deep earth ignites entire sedimentary basins. Drill cores from Siberia and seismic surveys suggest that the volume of these intrusions is enormous. Geochemical studies of boundary rocks, including weird spikes in certain carbon isotopes and the presence of specific organic molecules that look like byproducts of heated coal, support the idea that a lot of fossil carbon was cooked and released right when ecosystems were collapsing. If that's right, the Siberian traps weren't just a big volcano. They were a climate weaponized by geology, a mantle plume supercharged by all the carbon, sulfur and halogens stored in the crust. Which raises a crucial question. Earth has seen other large igneous provinces. Massive basalt floods in the Deccan region of India coincide with the end Cretaceous extinction. The Central Atlantic magmatic province lines up with the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. Earlier in Earth history there are others, some of comparable or even greater volume than the Siberian traps. Yet the Permian-Triassic extinction is still the worst spike in the fossil record. So why this one? What made this particular volcanic episode so uniquely devastating? Maybe it's the starting conditions. Pangaea's supercontinent geometry, already dry interiors, and vulnerable reef systems could have primed the biosphere to be more fragile than at other times. Maybe it's the composition and thickness of Siberia's sedimentary pile, unusually rich in coal, organics, and evaporites, providing far more fuel for intrusive magma to volatilize. Maybe it's the tempo, not just how much magma was erupted, but how fast, in how many pulses, and how those pulses lined up with critical thresholds in the climate and carbon cycle. Or maybe there were other players involved. Subtle, hard-to-see factors like changes in ocean circulation, shifts in nutrient delivery, even an impact or two, that turned a bad volcanic event into a total catastrophe. That's the mystery hanging over the Siberian traps. They look guilty. They have motive, means, and a suspiciously good alibi in the timeline. They can explain a lot of what we see: massive greenhouse warming, acid rain, a wild carbon isotope excursion, repeated environmental shocks stretching into the early Triassic. But as we follow the trail from erupting basalt to dying reefs, breathless oceans and acidifying seas, we'll find that volcanism is just the opening move. How that move cascades through the climate system and the oceans, that's where the real killing happens. First stop. What happens when a planet's thermostat is twisted hard in the direction of hot and doesn't get turned back for millions of years? On a planet with normal geography, you might have some room for error. Spread your continents around, mix in some oceans at different latitudes, and when the climate starts to drift, you've got natural shock absorbers, coastlines that moderate temperature, currents that move heat around, rain belts that can shift without leaving entire land masses completely dry. But at the end of the Permian, Earth wasn't running that configuration. It was running hard mode. Almost all of the major land masses were welded together into a single supercontinent, Pangaea. One colossal land block stretching nearly from pole to pole, with a single gigantic ocean, Panthalassa, wrapping around it, and the smaller Tethys Ocean cutting into its eastern margin. That geography is not neutral for climate. It loads the dice. Coastlines tend to have mild, moist climates because water stores heat and evaporates easily. Deep continental interiors, far from the sea, do not. They swing between scorching heat and bitter cold. They also tend to be dry. Moist air from the oceans loses its water as rain before it can penetrate thousands of kilometres inland. Now add a massive, long-lived injection of greenhouse gases on top of that setup. CO2 rises, the greenhouse blanket thickens, more heat stays in the system. Global average temperatures climb, but averages don't tell the whole story. Because of Pangaea, that extra heat doesn't get spread evenly. It piles up over land, especially over the already arid interior. The result is not just warmer weather, it's climatic amplification. Models of late Permian climate under elevated CO2 consistently produce terrifying numbers. Land surface temperatures in the tropics and subtropics pushing into the high 30s or 40s Celsius on a regular basis, with heat waves far beyond that. Nights that don't cool off enough for heat-stressed organisms to recover. Seasons where evaporation strips water from soils and lakes faster than any feasible rainfall can replace it. And that's the gentle version, the output of computer models limited by assumptions and coarse grids. When we turn to the rocks, the story gets sharper. One of the best ways to track ancient temperature is through oxygen isotopes, particularly the ratio of oxygen-18 to oxygen-16 in carbonate minerals and fossil shells. At a basic level, warmer waters and warmer conditions shift that ratio in predictable ways. Across the Permian-Triassic boundary, multiple sections show exactly what you'd expect if the planet's thermostat had been twisted hard toward hot. Oxygen isotope values that drop, consistent with a rapid increase in temperature. Some studies translate those signals into global mean surface warming of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius or more over geologically short intervals, tens to hundreds of thousands of years. But it's not all clean and tidy. Those isotopes can be altered after burial. Different fossil groups live in different depths and seasons. Some data sets point to truly extreme temperatures, especially in low-latitude shallow seas, water that may have regularly exceeded 35 degrees Celsius, close to the upper limit for many marine animals. Others suggest more modest warming, or multiple spikes rather than a single smooth ramp. So we don't have a single, universally agreed-on number. What we do have is convergence. Almost every line of evidence points toward a rapid, large-scale warming, with especially intense heat in the tropics and on land. The fossils themselves show the stress. In some plant fossils from late Permian and earliest Triassic rocks, you see changes in leaf size and shape that are typical of drought and heat stress. Smaller leaves with thicker cuticles, adaptations to limit water loss. Stomata, the tiny pores plants use to exchange gases, become fewer and smaller in many lineages, a physiological response to elevated CO2. In conifer growth rings, you see patterns that suggest irregular, harsh seasons rather than stable, predictable climates. By the time you get into the earliest Triassic, in many places, you don't see much plant macrofossil diversity at all. Forests that once hosted complex canopies are replaced in the record by a much more monotonous, scrappy flora. And in the sediments, a different signal of catastrophe shows up: charcoal. Charcoal is fossilized burn. It forms when vegetation burns in wildfires hot enough to carbonize plant material, but not completely oxidize it to CO2. In late Permian and boundary layers from multiple continents, there are spikes in charcoal abundance. That implies frequent intense fires sweeping across landscapes that, paradoxically, are drying out. More heat means more evaporation. More evaporation means parched soils and vegetation. With the right wind conditions, which a supercontinent with stark temperature contrast can easily supply, huge regions can become tinderboxes. Burn the vegetation cover off a continent and another process kicks in: erosion. Without roots to hold soil and canopies to break rainfall, even the sporadic storms of a drying climate become weapons. When it does rain, it doesn't gently soak in. It hits bare ground and runs off in sheets, carving gullies, stripping topsoil, and carrying sediment into rivers and onto continental shelves. Across the Permian-Triassic boundary, many basins record exactly that kind of shift. From mature, well-structured soils and stable river systems to chaotically stacked, coarse, erosion-dominated deposits. You see thick packages of sandstone and conglomerate, signs of flashy high-energy flows. Fine-grained, organic-rich floodplain sediments, the quiet archives of long-lived ecosystems, become rarer. In some places, there's evidence of what geologists call coal gap conditions, intervals where, for millions of years, almost no new coal forms. Since coal is essentially fossil swamp and bog vegetation, A coal gap means those lush, waterlogged ecosystems nearly disappeared. On land, that's as close as you get to a "this habitat is gone" warning label. All of this paints a picture of a terrestrial biosphere being hit from multiple angles. Higher temperatures increase plant respiration and water demand. Drought and erratic rainfall make that water harder to find. Acid rain adds chemical stress, damaging leaves and soils. Wildfires repeatedly reset recovering vegetation. Erosion removes the fertile layer that plants need to re-establish. Animal life that depends on those plants, from herbivorous therapsids to invertebrates, loses both food and habitat. But this isn't just a land problem. The land and sea are tied together by the climate system, and one of the simplest physical relationships is also one of the deadliest. Warm water holds less dissolved gas than cold water. That includes oxygen. If you take the same parcel of seawater and heat it up by several degrees, the maximum amount of oxygen it can physically contain drops. That's basic chemistry. On a warmer Earth, even if everything else stayed the same, the oceans would start with less available oxygen. Everything else did not stay the same. Warmer temperatures also speed up metabolic rates. Many marine organisms breathe faster, need more oxygen, and live closer to their physiological limits. At the same time, changes in wind patterns and stratification under high CO2 can reduce mixing between surface waters and deep waters. Less mixing means less oxygen transport into the depths. Now add in the increased nutrient delivery from all that continental erosion, rivers carrying loads of phosphorus and nitrogen from stripped soils into coastal seas. That can fuel algal blooms. When those blooms die and sink, bacteria decompose them, consuming oxygen in the process. The result is a dangerous feedback. Warming reduces oxygen solubility. Warming and nutrient loading increase oxygen consumption, and ocean circulation struggles to resupply what's being used up. That's the road toward widespread low oxygen and anoxic conditions. The oceans without breath we'll explore in the next section. Climate change driven by volcanism doesn't neatly separate into land crisis and ocean crisis. It's a coupled catastrophe. Drought, heat, and erosion on Pangaea's continents were feeding the very processes that would suffocate life in the seas. And then there's the idea that in some places, especially near the equator, heat alone may have been directly lethal. Today there's a concept called wet bulb temperature, a measure that combines heat and humidity. For humans and many animals, sustained wet bulb temperatures above about 35 degrees Celsius become unsurvivable because the body can no longer shed heat by sweating. Even resting in the shade, you slowly cook. Permian animals didn't sweat like we do, and plants have different limits, but the principle is the same. There are thresholds beyond which physiology simply breaks. Some climate models of the End-Permian suggest that, over tropical land areas, combinations of temperature and humidity could have routinely exceeded the tolerance of large vertebrates, maybe even smaller ones. In the oceans, tropical surface waters may have approached or surpassed the upper thermal limits for many marine invertebrates. Out of this comes the lethal heat belt hypothesis. Imagine a broad band around the equator where, for much of the year, conditions are simply too hot, or too hot and humid, for complex life to function. Not everywhere, not at every hour, but often enough that survival becomes a desperate marginal affair. Animals trying to migrate through those zones encounter deadly heat stress. Plants fail to establish stable communities. Plankton and reef builders in shallow tropical seas live in water so warm it pushes their biochemistry to the edge. Meanwhile, higher latitudes, while still stressed, might remain marginally more habitable. Cooler summers, lower humidity, and less brutal extremes could act as refuges. There are hints in the fossil record that fit this pattern. Stronger extinction signals in equatorial marine faunas, with some groups surviving better in temperate regions. On land, the record is sparser, but there are indications of biogeographic shifts. Lineages retreating poleward, low-latitude ecosystems simplified or almost absent. The lethal heat belt idea is not universally accepted. The exact thresholds, and how Permian animals and plants would have coped, are debated. Some researchers argue that the models overshoot. Others think they might still underestimate local extremes. But as a working concept, it captures something essential. Warming was not just a background stressor. In some regions, it may have backed life into a thermal corner from which there was no escape. Put all these pieces together, Pangaea's unforgiving geometry, runaway greenhouse warming, mega-droughts, wildfires, soil loss, collapsing plant communities, and the physical limits of heat tolerance, and you get a terrestrial biosphere teetering on the edge. Forests thin, then vanish. Rivers turn from stable, meandering lifelines into erratic, sediment-choked torrents. Huge swathes of the supercontinent become seasonal dust bowls. The few survivors cling to refuges, highlands with cooler microclimates, coastal strips that still catch some moisture, polar regions less assaulted by lethal heat. And all the while, the same climate engine that is baking the continents is quietly sabotaging the oceans, stripping them of oxygen and stability. On land, the catastrophe is obvious. Dead trees, empty forests, vanished herbivores. Beneath the waves, the disaster is harder to see, but ultimately even more far-reaching, because once the oceans stop breathing, recovery is no longer just about waiting for the rains to return, it's about rewriting the chemistry of an entire planet. That's where we're headed next. When we say the oceans stopped breathing, that's not just a dramatic metaphor. Oceans really do breathe. Under normal conditions, surface waters exchange gases with the atmosphere. Wind and waves mix oxygen-rich water downward. Cooler polar waters sink, carrying dissolved oxygen into the deep. Organic matter rains out from the surface, decomposes, and uses up some of that oxygen, but not all of it. As long as mixing keeps pace with consumption, you get a vertical conveyor belt that keeps most of the ocean at least somewhat hospitable to complex life. Now imagine that system slowly suffocating. Two terms are crucial here, anoxia and euxenia. Anoxia just means no oxygen. In anoxic waters, the dissolved oxygen concentration drops so low that aerobic organisms, things that breathe oxygen, are in serious trouble. Many fish, invertebrates, and even some microbes simply can't function. Euxenia is anoxia plus something worse, hydrogen sulfide. In a euxinic ocean, there's no oxygen, and sulfate-reducing bacteria take over, using sulfate instead of oxygen to metabolize organic matter. One of the main byproducts of that metabolism is H2S, hydrogen sulfide gas. To us, in small concentrations, it smells like rotten eggs. In higher concentrations, it's outright lethal. It binds to the same enzymes that oxygen uses in your cells and shuts them down. So how do you get an entire ocean, or large chunks of it, to flip from oxygenated to anoxic, and then to poisonous? You start by shutting down the mixing. Warm the surface so much that the density contrast between surface and deep water increases. Freshen it in some places with precipitation and runoff, making it even lighter. The result is strong stratification, a stable layering where the surface sits like a warm, buoyant lid on top of cooler, denser deep water. If that lid is strong enough, wind energy and currents struggle to overturn it. Oxygen entering at the surface has a hard time reaching depth. Meanwhile, organic matter is still sinking, still decomposing, still consuming what oxygen is left in the deeper layers. Given enough time under those conditions, the deep ocean can slide into full anoxia. Near coasts where nutrient runoff from the land is fueling big blooms of algae and plankton, the problem gets even worse. More productivity at the surface means more dead organic matter raining down, more bacterial decomposition, more oxygen sucked out of the water column. Once oxygen is gone, the only organisms that can thrive are those adapted to life without it, and many of those change the chemistry of the water in ways that leave fingerprints in the rocks. That's how we know this happened at the end of the Permian. One of the clearest signatures is in the form of black shales and mudstones laid down across vast areas of the world's continental shelves and basins right at, or just after, the extinction horizon. These rocks are dark because they're rich in organic matter that never fully decomposed. In oxygenated settings, most of that organic material gets oxidized, basically burned, back into CO2. In anoxic settings, it can be preserved. But the real story is in the details. Look closely, and you find abundant pyrite, iron sulfide, often as tiny framboids, little raspberry-shaped aggregates of crystals. Those framboids tend to form in euxinic waters, where there's plenty of hydrogen sulfide to react with dissolved iron. The size distribution of those framboids can even tell you something about how pervasive the anoxia was in the water column. Then there are the redox-sensitive metals, elements like uranium, molybdenum, vanadium, and others whose behavior depends strongly on the presence or absence of oxygen. In oxygenated seawater, they tend to stay dissolved. In anoxic or sulfidic conditions, they get scavenged out and locked into sediments. Across the Permian-Triassic boundary in many marine sections, you see spikes in these metals, especially molybdenum and uranium, relative to background levels. That's a clue that large areas of the seafloor were overlain by low oxygen or euxinic waters that were pulling these elements out of solution and concentrating them in sediments. Isotopes add another layer. Sulfur isotopes, for example, can be fractionated by bacterial sulfate reduction. Carbon isotopes can reflect changes in the balance between organic carbon burial and oxidation. In many sections, you see shifts consistent with massive increases in organic matter burial under anoxic conditions, followed by complex oscillations as the system struggled toward a new equilibrium. All of these geochemical threads, black shales, pyrite framboids, metal enrichments, isotope excursions, point in the same direction. At and after the Great Dying, large portions of the ocean were starved of oxygen in a way that was unusual even by deep-time standards. But anoxia alone doesn't get you to the most extreme scenarios people have proposed. For that, you need hydrogen sulfide not just in isolated pockets, but potentially rising toward the surface and even escaping into the atmosphere. Hydrogen sulfide is a double-edged sword. In small amounts, certain microbes love it. They can use it as an energy source, oxidizing it to sulfate and building their metabolisms around that chemistry. But for most complex animals, especially those adapted to oxygen-rich conditions, exposure to high levels of H2S is catastrophic. In the ocean, H2S-rich waters can create kill zones even if some oxygen lingers near the surface. Upwelling of sulfidic deep waters into shallow habitats would have turned coastal seas into death traps. Animals can't just hold their breath through that. Their very biochemistry fails. Some researchers have argued that during peak euxinic episodes, hydrogen sulfide might have escaped into the atmosphere in large enough quantities to have global or near-global effects. At certain concentrations, H2S destroys ozone. Strip away enough of the ozone layer, and you let more UV radiation from the sun reach the surface. That amplifies biological stress on land and in shallow waters, damaging DNA, impairing plant growth, and adding another invisible weapon to the End-Permian arsenal. This is where the purple ocean idea enters the picture. On a healthy modern Earth, a lot of surface ocean productivity is driven by phytoplankton, algae and cyanobacteria that use oxygenic photosynthesis and give the ocean its familiar blue-green hues. In a strongly euxinic ocean, especially in sunlit but sulfidic surface layers, a different cast of characters could move in: green and purple sulfur bacteria. These microbes are anoxigenic phototrophs. They use light, but instead of splitting water and releasing oxygen, they use hydrogen sulfide as an electron donor and produce elemental sulfur as a waste product. They thrive at the interface between light and sulfide, exactly the sort of niche you'd expect to see in a stratified sulfidic ocean with limited oxygen. Biochemically, they leave their own kind of graffiti. Their membranes contain distinctive pigments and lipids. Over time, those can break down into molecular fossils, biomarkers, that persist in sediments. Certain carotenoids derived from green and purple sulfur bacteria have been reported in Permian-Triassic boundary rocks, especially in sections that also show strong evidence for anoxia and sulfidic conditions. Those molecular traces are one of the pillars of the purple ocean hypothesis, the idea that, at least in some regions, the ocean's photic zone, the sunlit upper layer, was no longer dominated by the typical plankton of an oxygenated sea, but by sulfide-eating microbes that would have given the water a strange purplish or greenish cast. In that scenario, the End-Permian oceans weren't just low on oxygen. They were fundamentally reorganized, biologically and chemically, with microbial communities more reminiscent of Earth's early Archean seas than of anything we see today. But how far did that transformation go? Did the entire global ocean flip into a stagnant, sulfidic, microbe-dominated state from surface to seafloor? Or were these conditions patchy, intense in some basins and shelves, weaker or absent elsewhere? That's one of the biggest debates in the field. Some datasets, especially from the Tethys region and parts of what is now China, support the idea of very widespread persistent anoxia and euxinia. Coupled carbon and sulfur isotopes from those areas have been interpreted as evidence that more than half, perhaps much more, of the global seafloor was overlain by anoxic bottom waters during parts of the crisis. Other records, including some from high-latitude sections and from different ocean basins, suggest a more nuanced picture. oxygen-poor and anoxic zones expanding dramatically compared to normal, but not necessarily wrapping the entire deep ocean in a uniform suffocating blanket. There's also the question of timing and variability. In some cores, the geochemical signals of strongest Anoxia and Euxenia lag slightly behind the peak extinction interval, or recur in pulses during the earliest Triassic. That's led some researchers to argue that the Great Dying was associated with a sequence of expanding and contracting dead zones, huge, regional-scale anoxic and euxinic episodes linked to bursts of volcanism, climate swings, and nutrient pulses. In that view, the End-Permian oceans were highly unstable, flip-flopping between slightly less bad and truly nightmarish states over hundreds of thousands of years. Different basins would have been out of phase, some suffocating while others briefly recovered, only to crash again as circulation patterns and climate shifted. Why does this distinction matter? Because the severity, extent and persistence of ocean anoxia and euxinia control how you think about both the extinction and the recovery. If the deep global ocean was almost uniformly anoxic for millions of years, then the survival of complex marine life becomes a story of narrow refuges, shallow, well-ventilated shelves or high-latitude regions where cooler, denser waters could still carry some oxygen. Recovery would be brutally slow because you'd have to completely rebuild large-scale circulation and oxygenation before many ecosystems could re-establish. If instead Anoxia and Euxenia were intense but more regional and episodic, then the pattern of extinction could look different, severe but patchy, with some lineages hanging on in scattered pockets and recolonizing devastated areas during brief windows of improved conditions. Recovery could start earlier in some basins while others lagged far behind. The truth may sit between those extremes, a world ocean where low oxygen conditions became the norm over vast areas, punctuated by expansions into fully euxinic, H2S-rich states during the worst pulses of volcanic forcing and climate disruption. Either way, for marine animals adapted to a relatively well-oxygenated Permian ocean, this was a radical shift. Reef builders, which often need clear, well-oxygenated water, vanish or nearly vanish. Mobile predators that depend on high metabolic rates and plenty of oxygen, things like many fish and cephalopods, struggle. Benthic communities on the seafloor are repeatedly flattened as anoxic waters spread and retreat. And above it all, if the more extreme versions of the Purple Ocean hypothesis are right, the atmosphere itself may have been chemically destabilized by waves of hydrogen sulfide and methane, adding to warming, ozone loss, and UV stress on land. The End-Permian oceans weren't just a passive backdrop to a land-based catastrophe. They were an active engine of extinction, a place where physics, chemistry, and microbial ecology conspired to make most of the planet's largest habitat unrecognizable to complex life. But the story of the oceans doesn't end with suffocation. Once you change who's doing the breathing, you change what happens to carbon, to acidity, to the entire feedback system that keeps a planet habitable. And that's where another layer of the mystery comes in, how the same processes that stripped oxygen from the sea also shattered the carbon cycle and turned the oceans into acid baths. If you take that suffocating, stratified, microbe-dominated ocean and ask, what happens to carbon in a world like this? The answer is, nothing good. To see why, we have to talk about something that sounds abstract but turns out to be one of the sharpest weapons in the End-Permian arsenal, ocean acidification. On a basic chemical level, the oceans are giant carbon sponges. CO2 in the atmosphere dissolves into surface waters. Once it's in, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid. That acid partly dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Those hydrogen ions are the key. More of them means lower pH, more acidic conditions. Marine organisms that build shells or skeletons out of calcium carbonate, things like corals, many plankton, brachiopods, some algae, depend on a delicate balance. They need carbonate ions to be available in the water column so they can combine them with calcium and precipitate solid CaCO3. Acidification attacks that process from both sides. As CO2 levels climb and more carbonic acid forms, the chemistry shifts. Some of the carbonate ions get converted into bicarbonate. The pool of free carbonate shrinks. At the same time, those extra hydrogen ions make existing calcium carbonate more likely to dissolve. Economically, you could think of it as raising the price of raw materials while also melting your factories. Under more acidic conditions, the saturation state of calcium carbonate minerals drops. Below certain thresholds, it becomes energetically expensive, and eventually physically impossible, for organisms to maintain and grow their shells and skeletons. Thin-shelled forms are hit first. Reefs, which are literally piles of calcium carbonate built up by generations of organisms, start to erode faster than they can accrete. At the end of the Permian, that's exactly what we see. Spectacular reef systems that had dominated many shallow shelves, built not by modern corals but by sponges, algae and calcifying microbes, collapse. In many sections, there's a sharp transition from reefal limestones packed with skeletal material to microbialites and disaster facies dominated by opportunistic, non-calcifying life. In some places, you get horizons full of dissolved, pitted or overgrown shells, a kind of fossilized acid burn. In others, there's a nearly complete disappearance of heavily calcified plankton and benthic organisms right across the extinction boundary. These aren't just victims of warming and low oxygen. They're exactly the kinds of organisms you'd expect to lose in a rapid acidification event, the ones whose entire business model depends on stable carbonate chemistry. So where did all that extra carbon come from? One of the most powerful pieces of evidence is hidden in the ratio of carbon isotopes, the relative amounts of the heavier isotope, carbon-13, and the lighter one, carbon-12, preserved in limestones and organic matter. Under normal Earth conditions, the global carbon cycle keeps those ratios within a fairly stable range. Biological processes fractionate carbon in predictable ways. Photosynthetic organisms prefer the lighter isotope, so organic matter tends to be enriched in C12 relative to the inorganic carbon left behind. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, that balance breaks. Across the world, in both marine and terrestrial records, you see a sharp negative carbon isotope excursion, a sudden shift toward lighter values, meaning a relative increase in C12 in the carbon reservoir being sampled. The magnitude of that shift is huge by geological standards. In some sections it's 4 to 6 per mil, in others even larger. And it happens quickly in stratigraphic terms, right around the time of maximum biodiversity loss. Interpreting that shift is like reading the printout of a planetary stress test. You can get a big negative excursion in a few ways. One is to inject a massive amount of isotopically light carbon into the atmosphere-ocean system. Another is to dramatically change the balance between organic carbon burial and oxidation. During the End-Permian, both were probably in play. Volcanic CO2 from the Siberian traps is the obvious starting point. Mantle-derived CO2 has a characteristic isotopic signature, slightly lighter than average marine carbonate, but not extremely so. To get a carbon isotope excursion as large as the one we see, the amount of volcanic CO2 alone would have to be enormous and delivered relatively quickly. The scale of the Siberian eruptions certainly offers that possibility. Millions of cubic kilometers of basalt belching CO2 over hundreds of thousands of years. But there's a catch. The isotopic fingerprint of the negative excursion is lighter than you'd expect from mantle carbon alone. That points to additional sources of very light carbon being mobilized, sources rich in C12 compared to the bulk Earth. One candidate is methane. Methane produced biologically, by microbes breaking down organic matter, is extremely depleted in C13. Large-scale destabilization of methane hydrates on continental margins, or massive release of thermogenic methane from deeper sediments heated by intruding magma, could inject a powerful isotopically light pulse into the atmosphere. Some models of the End-Permian carbon cycle invoke exactly this. Initial warming from volcanic CO2 pushes temperature and ocean chemistry past a threshold, destabilizing methane clathrates in seafloor sediments. As methane bubbles up and oxidizes to CO2 in the water column and atmosphere, it adds to the greenhouse effect and further acidifies the ocean. But the methane hydrate story comes with caveats. Modern methane hydrates are associated with cold, high-pressure environments on continental slopes, systems tied to our particular climate and ocean circulation. The late Permian had very different boundary conditions, a supercontinent, different sea levels, different thermal gradients. Whether there were comparable hydrate reservoirs in comparable volumes is still debated. Alternative sources of light carbon might have been even more directly linked to the Siberian traps themselves. As those huge volumes of magma forced their way through the crust, they didn't just erupt lava at the surface, they cooked the rocks they passed through. In Siberia, those rocks include thick sequences of organic-rich sediments, coals and petroleum source rocks, as well as carbonates containing solid carbonates and even evaporates. When you heat organic-rich rocks with magma, you can drive off large volumes of CO2 and methane with very light isotopic signatures. Essentially, you're performing industrial-scale pyrolysis underground, turning buried organic carbon into greenhouse gases. There's direct geological evidence for these kinds of interactions. Contact metamorphic aureoles around intrusions, pipes of burned and mobilized material, and geochemical signatures that point to thermogenic gas generation. Some researchers argue that this baking of the basin could have released enough light carbon to explain a large fraction of the isotope excursion, especially if it happened in pulses synchronized with major eruptive phases. What about land-based carbon stores, the End-Permian analogues of permafrost and peatlands? The late Permian world supported extensive forests and swampy lowlands. As climate warmed and dried in many regions, those ecosystems burned and decayed. That would have released CO2, much of it isotopically light. Charcoal layers across the boundary are consistent with widespread wildfires, but stacking up the numbers is difficult. Even if you incinerate enormous forests, the total carbon stored in terrestrial biomass is small compared to the integrated capacity of the mantle, the ocean, and long-buried sediments. It's likely that burning vegetation contributed, especially regionally, but puzzling out how much it moved the global isotopic needle is an active area of research. There's one more subtle piece to the puzzle. What happens to carbon once it's in that anoxic, acidifying ocean? Under oxygenated conditions, a lot of sinking organic matter gets remineralized, oxidized back to CO2 before it reaches the seafloor. Under widespread anoxia, more of that organic carbon can be buried and preserved. In principle, increased organic carbon burial tends to drive the isotopic composition of the remaining carbon reservoir in the opposite direction, toward heavier values, because you're preferentially removing C12. But in the Permian Triassic record, we see a negative excursion. That tells us that during the critical interval, inputs of light carbon from volcanism and associated processes overwhelmed any isotopic gain from enhanced burial. The whole system was being flooded faster than it could sequester. Once that flood started, feedbacks kicked in. More atmospheric CO2 means stronger greenhouse warming. Stronger warming means a more stratified ocean, and weaker, overturning circulation. Weaker circulation and hotter waters mean less oxygen at depth. Less oxygen means more areas where organic matter can escape oxidation and be buried, which over longer timescales would normally help draw CO2 back down. But in the short term, those low oxygen conditions change which microbes are in charge. Instead of aerobic decomposers returning CO2 to the water, you get more sulfate reducers producing hydrogen sulfide, and more methanogens in sediments producing methane. Some of that methane gets oxidized, some may escape. Either way, you're reshuffling the forms and fates of carbon in ways that favor more greenhouse gases and more stress on carbonate chemistry. Acidification, warming, and low oxygen reinforce each other. Warmer water holds less dissolved CO2 at equilibrium, but if you keep forcing CO2 into the system from above and below, you just drive the partial pressure higher and push more into solution. Stratification traps that altered chemistry near the surface where most calcifiers live. Fish and invertebrates already stressed by hypoxia now have to maintain internal chemistry against a more corrosive background. Reefs, which once acted as both habitats and modest long-term carbon sinks, disintegrate. In that environment, who survives? Not the classic Permian reef builders, not many heavily calcified plankton. Instead, you see a rise of disaster taxa, thin-shelled or unmineralized organisms, microbial mats, opportunistic bivalves that can tolerate swings in chemistry and low oxygen better than their predecessors. The very architecture of marine ecosystems shifts from rigid, carbonate-dominated frameworks to soft, microbial, and mud-dominated worlds. For all our data, one problem remains stubbornly unsolved: getting the numbers to line up. We can measure the size of the carbon isotope excursion. We can estimate with uncertainties how fast it happened. We can approximate how much carbon you'd have to inject, with what isotopic composition, to match those curves in various models. But no single source fits everything perfectly. If you rely mostly on volcanic CO2, you struggle to explain the isotopic lightness without invoking truly staggering volumes or additional fractionating processes. If you lean heavily on methane hydrates, you run into questions about whether such reservoirs existed at scale under late Permian conditions, and whether they could be destabilized rapidly enough. If you emphasize thermogenic gases from baked sediments, you need to pin down exactly how much organic matter was available to cook and how efficiently it was converted. On top of that, the carbon isotope record itself isn't a single neat line. Different basins show slightly different patterns, rapid drops, stepwise changes, partial recoveries, secondary excursions into the earliest Triassic. That hints at a complex sequence of pulses, feedbacks, and regional responses, not one monolithic carbon dump. Most researchers now favour some kind of hybrid scenario. Volcanic CO2 from the Siberian traps provides the initial and ongoing push. Intrusion into organic-rich strata releases additional lighter carbon in bursts. Climate warming and ocean changes may destabilise some methane reservoirs, adding further pulses. At the same time, widespread anoxia modulates how much carbon is buried versus recycled, creating the oscillations and lags we see. But the exact mix, the proportions, the timing, the thresholds, is still under active debate. And this matters, because how you apportion those sources changes how you think about cause and effect. Was the Great Dying primarily a story of direct volcanic forcing, with everything else as a downstream consequence? Or did the Earth system cross internal tipping points, in methane stability, in circulation, in ecosystem structure, that turned a bad situation into an almost unsurvivable one? To answer that, we have to look beyond the ocean, because while seas were turning acidic and reefs were crumbling, something equally dramatic was happening on land. Forests were collapsing, soils were washing away, and entire food webs were unravelling under the combined assault of heat, drought, poison, and maybe even a damaged sky. When people picture killer volcanoes, they usually imagine lava and ash, rivers of fire, ash clouds blotting out the sun. But the Siberian traps had another quieter weapon. Not just heat, not just CO2, but chemistry. Gases and metals dragged up from deep within the earth and cooked out of the rocks they intruded into. Invisible poisons that could turn rain into acid, soils into toxins, and even punch holes in the planet's protective ozone shield. To see how, you have to follow the magma underground. The Siberian traps weren't just eruptions at the surface. Huge sheets and fingers of magma, sills and dikes, pushed their way sideways through the crust, infiltrating layer after layer of different sediments. Coals, organic-rich shales, carbonates, evaporates loaded with salts. When you drive magma into those kinds of rocks, you don't just melt them, you chemically weaponize them. Organic-rich rocks, as we've seen, give you CO2 and methane when they're baked. Carbonates add even more CO2. But evaporates, beds of halite, gypsum and other salts, carry something else, halogens, chlorine, fluorine, bromine. Under normal circumstances, those elements are locked up as solid minerals. Heat them with magma, though, and they can volatilize, combining with hydrogen or other elements to form corrosive gases like HCl and HF, or halogen-bearing compounds that ride volcanic plumes up into the atmosphere. That's important, because halogens are ozone killers. Modern eruptions give us a clue. Some basaltic eruptions, especially those interacting with salty sediments or seawater, release huge amounts of hydrogen chloride and hydrogen fluoride. These gases can cause local acid rain and fluoride poisoning. But when halogens get lofted high enough, into the stratosphere, chlorine and bromine compounds can participate in catalytic cycles that destroy ozone molecules far more efficiently than natural UV breakdown alone. Now scale that up from a single eruption to a province the size of Western Europe erupting in pulses over hundreds of thousands of years, repeatedly intruding into halogen-rich strata. You're not just warming the planet, you might be chemically thinning the sky. This isn't just theoretical hand-waving, the rocks keep whispering the same story. Something toxic was in the air. One of the clearest chemical fingerprints is mercury. Mercury is a useful tracer because it's strongly associated with volcanism. Magma and volcanic gases can carry mercury from the mantle and from the sediments they heat. Once released, mercury can travel long distances through the atmosphere before being rained out and captured in sediments. It likes to bind to organic matter and fine particles, so it gets archived in muds, coals, and even ancient peats. At the Permian-Triassic boundary across multiple continents, you see sharp spikes in mercury concentrations in sedimentary rocks. China, South Africa, Europe, North America, over and over, right around the extinction horizon, the mercury levels jump. Often, If you normalize those values to organic carbon, the enrichment becomes even more striking. It looks like global pulses of mercury raining down on land and sea. That pattern is hard to explain without large-scale volcanic activity. It lines up nicely with the timing of major Siberian eruptive phases inferred from radiometric dating and volcanic volumes. It tells you, yes, something huge was outgassing metals and volatiles into the atmosphere. But mercury alone can't convict volcanism of mass murder. For one thing, mercury is mobile. It can be remobilized after deposition, especially in environments that are changing redox state. Exactly the kind of unstable, oxygen-poor conditions that characterized many late Permian and early Triassic basins. Some of what we measure today might be a smeared or amplified version of the original signal. For another, mercury spikes don't tell you exactly what else was in that volcanic soup. They're excellent at flagging something big and igneous happened, but less helpful for reconstructing the full cocktail of halogens, sulfur compounds and other trace metals that came along for the ride. And they don't directly measure ecological impact. A mercury spike in mud doesn't automatically mean forests died that year. Even so, the timing is suspicious. Mercury enrichments cluster near the extinction interval and sometimes recur in the chaotic, recovery-strangled early Triassic. That's not proof that mercury toxicity killed trilobites or trees, but it strongly supports the idea that the atmosphere was being repeatedly dosed with volcanic pollutants at exactly the wrong time. What would that have felt like on land? Imagine standing in a Permian forest. Now start adding the known ingredients: higher CO2, hotter temperatures, more droughts. On top of that, layer in acid rain. Volcanic eruptions inject enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. SO2 plus water yields sulfuric acid. Add halogen gases like HCl and HF, and your raindrops become a chemical attack. Modern analogues show that even relatively modest eruptions can produce rain with a pH in the range of battery acid, at least regionally and for short periods. Repeated across many pulses, on a global or near-global scale, acid rain does a few things exceptionally well. First, it leaches nutrients from soils: calcium, magnesium, potassium. The basic ions plants need to build tissues and regulate their internal chemistry, get washed out or locked into forms that are harder to use. Forests already stressed by heat and drought suddenly find that their roots are sitting in nutrient-depleted, chemically altered dirt. Second, acid rain accelerates weathering of rocks and soils, breaking down minerals and mobilizing metals. Some of those metals, like aluminum, can become toxic to plant roots at high concentrations and low pH. Others, like iron, can clog up transport systems or change the availability of phosphorus and trace elements. Third, the acid and metal runoff doesn't just stay on land. It pours into rivers, lakes, and coastal seas. Freshwater ecosystems, which are generally less buffered than the open ocean, can experience rapid pH swings and metal pulses. Fish and amphibians are particularly sensitive to those changes. Eggs and larvae are often the first to die. The geological record around the Permian-Triassic boundary shows exactly the kind of cascade you'd expect from that sort of chemical assault. In many regions, there's evidence for a coal gap, a long interval with almost no coal deposits. That suggests the near disappearance of peat-forming wetlands, which require relatively stable waterlogged conditions and persistent vegetation. Instead, you see sediments full of eroded soils, plant debris, and charcoal. Forests weren't just declining. They were collapsing, burning, and washing away. Freshwater records show their own signature of stress: turnover in fish and amphibian faunas, blooms of opportunistic algae and bacteria, and in some cases mineral deposits consistent with acidic, metal-rich waters. The land surface was literally being stripped, chemically and physically, and dumped into the basins below. And hovering over all of this is an even more unsettling possibility: that the Siberian traps didn't just poison the ground and water, they may have damaged the sky. Ozone in the stratosphere acts as Earth's sunscreen, absorbing most of the sun's high-energy ultraviolet B, UVB radiation. Destroy enough ozone, and the amount of UVB hitting the surface spikes. For you and me, that would mean more skin cancers, cataracts, immune suppression. For plants, it can mean damaged DNA, stunted growth, and malformed reproductive structures. For microscopic plankton and spores, it can be lethal. How could a volcanic province on the other side of the world reach all the way up to the ozone layer? those halogens again. When chlorine and bromine compounds are transported into the stratosphere, they can break apart under UV light, releasing reactive atoms that participate in catalytic cycles. One chlorine atom can destroy thousands of ozone molecules before being sequestered again. In the modern world, CFCs played that role. In the late Permian, halogen-rich volcanic emissions might have done something similar, especially if repeated pulses kept the atmosphere from fully recovering between hits. But might have is doing a lot of work there. We can't sample the Permian stratosphere directly. So researchers look for indirect biological fingerprints of UV stress. One of the most important comes from something tiny: fossil spores and pollen. Plants protect their reproductive cells with tough outer walls made of sporopollenin, a highly resistant biopolymer. To shield DNA from UVB, many modern plants thicken those walls or change their chemistry, incorporating more UV-absorbing compounds. Under intense UV stress, you can also get malformed spores, distorted shapes, abnormal wall patterns, incomplete development. At the Permian-Triassic boundary in multiple regions, palynologists, scientists who study spores and pollen, have documented exactly those kinds of anomalies: abnormal, shriveled spores, high frequencies of malformed pollen grains. In some layers, you see a spike in so-called spore tetrads, groups of 4 spores that fail to separate properly during development, often interpreted as a sign of reproductive stress or mutagenic damage. Not all researchers agree on the interpretation. Some argue that these malformations could be caused by other stressors, pollutants, temperature swings, nutrient deficiencies, without invoking a global ozone collapse. Others point out that similar damage patterns can be produced experimentally by high UVB exposure in modern plants. The association between the worst spore damage and the extinction interval is suggestive, but not ironclad proof. Still, combine the halogen-rich geology of the Siberian region, models of volcanic plumes interacting with the stratosphere, and the fossil evidence for widespread reproductive stress in land plants, and a picture emerges. It's a world where forests are being hit from both sides: roots in acid-leached, metal-tainted soils, leaves and spores under an increasingly hostile sun. So where does that leave us? With a planet under multi-layered assault, warming oceans losing oxygen, acidified seas dissolving shells, mercury and other metals raining out of volcanic skies, soils stripped by acid rain and erosion, fresh waters pulsed with toxins, and maybe, on top of it all, a thinned ozone layer letting lethal UVB spear deeper into ecosystems already on the brink. But it also leaves us with questions. How big were those halogen releases really? Did ozone depletion happen as a brief catastrophic spike, or as a series of smaller repeated blows? Were heavy metals like mercury directly toxic at global scales, or mainly useful traces of something else? How exactly did acid rain timing line up with forest decline and freshwater extinctions? Right now, most researchers see these factors, halogens, heavy metals, acid rain, possible ozone loss, as amplifiers. They took a climate system already destabilized by CO2 and carbon cycle chaos and pushed it further out of balance. They probably weren't the sole killers, but they made every other stress harder to survive. To untangle which poisons mattered most and when, we need another line of evidence. One that doesn't come from the sea or the air, but from the impact scars of the solid Earth itself. Because there's one more suspect that keeps showing up in discussions of mass extinctions, a sudden visitor from space. And at the Permian-Triassic boundary, the impact question refuses to go away. If you've heard about dinosaur extinction, your brain is already primed for the next suspect. Big die-off must be a big rock. The Cretaceous-Paleogene event, the one that ended the non-avian dinosaurs, has wired us to look for craters, a single day of terror, global firestorms, a layer of dust and ash full of exotic elements. It's clean, it's cinematic, it's satisfying. So when scientists stared at the Permian-Triassic boundary, saw the scale of the disaster, and realized how fast parts of it seemed to happen, the question was almost inevitable. Was there a hidden Chicxulub of the Permian? To answer that, you first have to know what a cosmic hit job looks like in the rock record. A large asteroid or comet slamming into Earth does a few very specific things. It generates pressures so intense that quartz grains, some of the most common minerals in the crust, deform along microscopic planes. Under a microscope you see shocked quartz, neat sets of parallel lines that don't form under normal geological processes. The target rocks can also partially melt, forming glassy droplets called spherules that rain out around the world. It vaporizes part of the crust and projectile, injecting a dust cloud into the atmosphere. That dust can be enriched in certain elements, especially iridium. Iridium is rare in Earth's crust, but relatively abundant in many meteorites. When you find a thin global clay layer with a sharp spike in iridium right at an extinction boundary, like at the KPG, it's a smoking gun for an extraterrestrial source. It throws ejecta around the world, tiny beads of molten rock, high-temperature minerals that condense from impact plumes. In some cases, a rain of tiny glass spherules or microtectites gets deposited into sediments on every continent. And of course, it leaves a crater, not always well preserved, not always easy to spot under 252 million years of tectonics and erosion. But a basin with telltale circular or multi-ring geometry, shocked rocks, and characteristic internal structures. If a huge impact helped kill 96% of marine species and more than 2/3 of land vertebrates, we'd expect at least some of these things, repeated again and again at the right time in rocks around the planet. So, do we see them? This is where the Permian story diverges sharply from the dinosaur one. Start with iridium. At the KPG boundary, iridium spikes are almost boringly consistent. You can go to Italy, New Zealand, the United States, Spain. That thin clay layer is there, and the iridium enrichment is unmistakable. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, it's messy. Some sections show small iridium anomalies, others don't. In some places, the spikes are above or below the main extinction horizon. In others, they're smeared out over thicker intervals instead of sitting in a neat razor-thin line. There are also other ways to get a bit of extra iridium into sediments. Volcanic emissions can carry platinum group elements. Erosion of certain crustal rocks can locally enrich them. The signals we see at the PTR are nowhere near as large or globally consistent as the KPG layer. They're suggestive of something unusual in some basins, not a planet-wide dusting from a single titanic blast. What about shocked minerals? There have been claims. A few studies have reported grains that look like they've experienced impact-style pressures. Some have even described full shocked quartz at or near the Permian-Triassic boundary. But every one of those reports has been challenged. In many cases, later work re-examined the same grains and concluded the structures were not the clean, planar deformation, features you get from an impact, but other types of defects that can form under more mundane conditions: tectonic stress, metamorphism, even sample preparation. The microscope lines that once looked like smoking gun shock features turned out to be more ambiguous once more eyes and better instruments got involved. Then there are the craters themselves. Over the years, several candidates have been proposed as the Permian-Triassic kill crater. One of the most famous is the Bedut High, a buried structure off the northwest coast of Australia. In the early 2000s, some researchers argued it might be a 200-kilometre wide impact scar, roughly the right age. Seismic data hinted at a circular feature. Cores recovered from the area contained odd breccias and glassy rocks, some interpreted as impact melts. It was exciting. For a moment it seemed like we might have found the long-sought crater. Then the counter-arguments arrived. Other teams pointed out that the seismic data were low resolution and could just as easily match a volcanic or tectonic structure. The supposed impact melts could be reworked volcanic rocks. The age constraints were fuzzy, close to the Permian-Triassic boundary, but not tied down tightly enough to prove synchronicity with the extinction pulse. The consensus today leans heavily away from Bedut as a confirmed impact structure, let alone the definitive cause of the Great Dying. Another idea focused on Wilkes Land in East Antarctica. Gravity anomalies under the ice hint at a large buried basin, and some have speculated it might be an ancient impact crater. But the age is wildly unconstrained, and there is zero direct evidence linking it to the Permian. It's more of a "wouldn't it be cool if" than a serious candidate for the PTR killer. Smaller structures, in China, in Russia, in other parts of Australia, have also been floated as maybe this one options. But they tend to suffer the same problems: poor dating, ambiguous geology, limited evidence of shock, and in many cases sizes that are simply too small to be credible drivers of a global multi-realm mass extinction. Compare that to Chicxulub, a well-mapped multi-ring crater in the Yucatan, dated to within a tiny temporal window that overlaps almost perfectly with the KPG boundary, packed with unmistakable impact breccias and melt rocks, backed up by a global layer of iridium, shocked quartz, and spherules. The Permian Triassic case just doesn't look like that. It's not that there was definitely no impact at all around that time. Earth is constantly being hit, on all scales. Over tens of millions of years, you expect multiple significant impacts. The question is whether one of them was big enough and well-timed enough to be a primary or even major secondary driver of the extinction. Right now, the evidence for a dinosaur-style, globally dominant impact at 252 million years ago is weak. The signals we'd expect, a single, sharp, worldwide iridium spike, abundant and uncontested shocked minerals, a precisely dated large crater, just aren't there. Does that mean space rocks are off the hook entirely? Not necessarily. The story could be more nuanced. One possibility is that there was an impact, but it was only a minor contributor. One more stress piled onto an already buckling system. Remember, by the latest Permian, the planet was already in dire straits. Runaway greenhouse conditions, ocean anoxia, acidification, mercury pulses, possible ozone damage, forests collapsing. In such a fragile world, even a moderate asteroid strike, something too small to leave a Chicxulub-style global dust layer, but big enough to devastate a region and perturb the climate briefly, could have nudged ecosystems that last little bit toward irreversible collapse. Another possibility is timing. Some candidate impact signatures show up a bit before or a bit after the main extinction interval in certain sections. If a large impact occurred tens or hundreds of thousands of years off from the core extinction pulse, it might have acted as a trigger for environmental change that then unfolded over longer timescales, or it could have hammered already struggling biotas during the chaotic early Triassic recovery. In that scenario, the impact is part of the broader saga, but not the opening or closing chapter. A third option is coincidence. Over geological timescales, things overlap. Large igneous provinces erupt, sea levels shift, continents collide, asteroids hit. Some researchers argue that we may be overfitting, that a few scattered ambiguous signals near the Permian-Triassic boundary are simply the background noise of a very active planet, not clues to a hidden cosmic assassin. How do you decide between these possibilities? You go back to the core rule of the scientific process. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Claiming that a meteorite killed the dinosaurs is extraordinary. It was accepted not because it was a neat story, but because it was supported by a tight web of mutually reinforcing data. Iridium, shocked quartz, spherules, global layer, crater, timing. Claiming that a large impact was a major player in the greatest extinction event in Earth history is at least as extraordinary. It demands a similar level of global, consistent, precisely dated evidence. So far, the Permian rocks aren't delivering that. Instead, they keep pointing us back to the same main suspect. The Siberian traps and the Earth system feedbacks they set off. The warming, the acidification, the anoxia, the poisons from the deep. Not a single day of catastrophe, but a long, grinding, multi-stage crisis in which ecosystems were worn down, destabilized, and then finally tipped over the edge. That doesn't mean the impact question is closed. New drilling projects, improved dating techniques, and better geophysical imaging might still uncover a buried structure with the right age and the right shock features. Someone might find a clean, globally traceable impact layer we've somehow missed. If that happens, the story will have to be rewritten again. For now, though, most researchers treat impacts in the late Permian and early Triassic as background possibilities, maybe locally important, maybe minor amplifiers, not the main engine of extinction. Which brings us to an even more unsettling conclusion. The Great Dying may not have needed an asteroid at all. The planet, driven by internal tectonics and volcanic outpourings, was capable of nearly wiping its own slate clean. No space rock required. How exactly that self-inflicted catastrophe played out on land and forests, rivers, soils, and food webs is the next mystery. Because while oceans were turning into toxic, breathless basins, the continents were undergoing their own slow-motion apocalypse. On land, the story is somehow even uglier. When people talk about the Permian-Triassic extinction, they almost always start in the oceans. Anoxia, euxenia, acidification, whole reef systems turning into graveyards. But 252 million years ago, most of Earth's biomass wasn't in the sea. It was locked up in forests, coal swamp forests, glossopterous groves stretching across the southern supercontinent, vast lowland wetlands layered with ferns, seed ferns, early conifers and mosses, and thick tangled root networks holding soils together, insects buzzing in the canopy, synapsid proto-mammals hunting and scavenging underneath. That green engine shattered, and you can see its absence in one of the starkest signatures in the entire geologic record, the coal gap. For tens of millions of years before the extinction, the late Paleozoic is full of coal. Thick seams of compressed plant matter show that peat-forming swamps were widespread and persistent. Then you hit the Permian-Triassic boundary, and for roughly 5 to 10 million years, nothing. Globally, recognizable coal deposits almost vanish. That doesn't just mean fewer trees. It means that the kind of stable, waterlogged, organic-rich environments needed to build peat essentially broke down. Forests weren't just thinned. In many places, they collapsed so completely that the basic process of long-term carbon burial on land turned off. What does it take to do that? Start with heat. By the latest Permian, continental interiors on Pangaea were roasting. Summers in some regions may have regularly exceeded 40 or 50 degrees Celsius. Add intense seasonal drought, monsoons gone haywire, and you create conditions where even drought-tolerant plants struggle to hang on. Tree rings from just before the boundary show signs of severe water stress. Then, right at and above the boundary, you often lose tree rings entirely, because you lose the trees. Add acid rain. Siberian traps eruptions didn't just spew CO2, they pumped out sulfur and halogens. Those gases react in the atmosphere to form sulfuric and hydrochloric acids that fall back as highly acidic rain. Experimental work on modern plants shows that even moderately acidic rainfall can damage leaves, leach nutrients from soils, and stunt growth. Push it hard enough, and you kill seedlings before forests can regenerate. Add possible ozone damage and enhanced UV radiation. If volcanic halogens and other gases did erode the ozone layer, the continents would have been hit by stronger UVB. Fossil pollen and spores from the late Permian and early Triassic often show weird deformities, misshapen walls, abnormal splits, signs of developmental stress. Some researchers interpret this as plants being zapped by elevated UV, scrambling their reproductive tissues. It's not a unanimous interpretation, but it fits the bigger pattern of terrestrial stress. Now add fire. Hotter, drier conditions plus dead and dying vegetation is a recipe for megafires. Charcoal layers spike around the boundary in many sections. You see a world that's not just losing forests but watching them burn, over and over, before they have time to recover. At that point, the coal gap makes a brutal kind of sense. No stable wetlands, no dense long-lived forests, no thick mats of peat slowly accumulating, just stressed vegetation, burned soils, and brief, fragile plant communities that don't last long enough to leave behind big carbon deposits. And when forests fall, everything built on top of them goes with them. Before the Great Dying, land vertebrates were dominated by synapsids, your distant relatives. Not mammals yet, but their ancestors. Large, tusked herbivores like dicynodonts, big predators like gorgonopsians, odd, sail-backed forms in earlier Permian times. Amphibians, some the size of crocodiles, haunted rivers and swamps. Reptiles were present, but not yet the rulers they'd become later in the Triassic. Across the Permian-Triassic boundary, that world is gutted. Many of the iconic specialized synapsids vanish entirely. Large amphibians are hammered. Groups that took tens of millions of years to diversify are cut down to a handful of lineages. In some fossil sites, you see an abrupt turnover. Above a certain horizon, the classic Permian fauna is gone, replaced by a few disaster survivors and opportunists. But the pattern isn't completely uniform, and that matters. Some basins show a relatively sharp extinction in land vertebrates, nearly coincident with the marine crisis. Others hint at a more stepwise decline, with certain groups fading earlier as climates dry out and habitats fragment. There's an ongoing debate about just how sudden the extinction was on land. Was it an almost instantaneous crash, or a drawn-out, uneven thinning of ecosystems that only looks abrupt in the rock record? Either way, by early Triassic time, diversity on land is astonishingly low. In many places, the same few hardy synapsid genera show up again and again, across huge distances. It's like walking across an entire continent and seeing only a couple of kinds of mid-sized, slab-bodied herbivores trudging through a treeless wasteland. Insects get their own horror story. For most of the last 500 million years, insects have been absurdly resilient. They sailed through the dinosaur-killing impact with relatively minor casualties. But around the Permian-Triassic boundary, insect diversity seems to suffer a unique, true mass extinction. Fossil insect orders that had thrived in the lush coal forests of the late Paleozoic disappear. Leaf-feeding, wood-boring and pollinating guilds are rearranged or wiped out. There's a drop in the variety of feeding traces on fossil leaves, fewer chewing patterns, fewer intricate minds. It's as if entire ecological professions within the insect world either shrank dramatically or went extinct. Some researchers argue the signal is patchy and may partly reflect changes in where sediments were being preserved. But a growing body of evidence suggests something extraordinary did happen to terrestrial arthropods at this time. If you blow up forests, dry out wetlands, and scramble plant communities, the insects that depend on specific hosts or microhabitats follow them into oblivion. And freshwater? Freshwater systems are caught in the crossfire between dying land and dying seas. Think about what happens when you strip a landscape of vegetation. Roots no longer hold soil in place. Rainfall, which remember may be more intense and more erratic under greenhouse climates, hits bare ground and turns it into slurry. The late Permian early Triassic sedimentary record is full of exactly what you'd expect. Huge pulses of sand, silt and mud rushing off the continents. River channels migrate wildly. Floodplains become choked with thick, poorly sorted deposits. In many basins, the rocks just above the extinction boundary show a sudden switch to coarser, more chaotic sediments, a geological signature of landscapes literally falling apart. Those sediment pulses do two things to freshwater life. First, they physically destroy habitats. Rivers that used to meander through stable, vegetated valleys are replaced by braided, flashy systems that scour their own beds during floods and then shrink to shallow, warm trickles in the dry season. Lakes fill with sediment, becoming temporary ponds instead of long-lived basins. Any fish, amphibian or invertebrate adapted to calm, clear waters is in trouble. Second, they drive chemical chaos. Strip vegetation, and you not only increase erosion, you also change nutrient flows. Phosphorus and nitrogen that used to be locked in plant biomass get flushed into rivers and lakes. Combine that with warmer temperatures, and you get conditions ripe for algal and microbial blooms. In modern systems, we call this eutrophication, waters turning green, oxygen levels dropping, fish suffocating. There's evidence that similar processes may have played out on a planetary scale at the end of the Permian. Certain freshwater deposits show signs of intense microbial activity. Microbial mats, odd laminations, chemical signatures of low oxygen. If rivers and lakes were repeatedly swinging between scouring floods and stagnant oxygen-poor phases, freshwater ecosystems would have been hammered from both directions. Now layer all of this together and look at the food web. Every ecosystem, whether in a rainforest or a desert, rests on a foundation. Primary producers and the soils and microbes that support them. Plants capture sunlight. Fungi and bacteria cycle nutrients. Soils store water, buffer temperature swings, host root networks. Take out that base, or even just thin it enough, and everything above becomes exquisitely fragile. In late Permian terrestrial ecosystems, large herbivores relied on relatively predictable plant resources, foliage, seeds, roots, maybe seasonal flushes of growth. Predators relied on those herbivores. Scavengers relied on both. Insects pollinated and recycled plant tissues. Detritivores worked through dead organic matter, tying everything together. When forests collapse, the bottom of that pyramid shatters. Herbivores face famine. Those that survive are the ones that can eat almost anything. Tough shrubs, sparse ground cover, maybe even carrion. Predators either shrink their ranges, switch diets, or die. Insects specialized on particular plants disappear, while a few hardy generalists and detritivores eke out a living on whatever is left. The fossil record hints at exactly this kind of simplification. Food webs seem to contract into low-diversity, high-dominant systems where a small number of tolerant species do most of the ecological work. Think of it less as a rich, interlocking network, and more as a few frayed ropes trying to hold up the sky. Once you reach that point, global drivers, heat waves, droughts, acid rain pulses, episodes of UV stress, bursts of toxins like mercury and heavy metals, don't just cause temporary setbacks. They kick systems that are already wobbling off the edge. A drought in a lush, late Carboniferous coal forest might kill some trees and animals, but the system recovers. The seed bank is rich, soils are deep, biodiversity is high. A comparable drought on a deforested, eroding early Triassic floodplain can trigger local extinction. There's no canopy to shade seedlings, no organic rich soil to hold moisture, no diverse community of microbes and insects to quickly reassemble a functioning ecosystem. That's the brutal feedback loop of the great dying on land. Volcanic emissions heat the climate, acidify rain, and maybe damage the ozone layer. Forests suffer, burn, and vanish. Soils erode. Rivers and lakes turn into sediment-choked, oxygen-poor hazards. Food webs simplify, dominated by a few tolerant survivors. Those survivors are then even more vulnerable to the next pulse of stress from the same global engine. Another burst of CO2, another episode of extreme heat, another wave of acidic precipitation. And this isn't just one bad year, or even one bad century. These conditions persist, with ups and downs, for millions of years. That, more than anything, may be why the coal gap is so long, why terrestrial diversity takes so long to recover, why the early Triassic looks like a world stuck in ecological limbo. The physical and chemical drivers never really let up long enough for complex high-diversity forests and food webs to re-establish. If the oceans show us that you can suffocate a planet, the land shows us you can starve it and strip it bare. But even after all of that, the story isn't just one of death. Slowly, unevenly, new forests and new faunas claw their way back. Early conifers, ginkgos, and other hardy plants spread. New kinds of reptiles rise to dominance. The ecological deck is reshuffled. How long that recovery took, why it was so delayed compared to some other extinctions, and what that tells us about the full chain of causes behind the great dying. That's where the mystery deepens again. And it's where we turn next, when we ask why, after decades of study, science still can't fully explain how this catastrophe unfolded. So after all that, you might think we've basically solved it. Huge volcanism in Siberia, runaway greenhouse warming, oceans losing oxygen, turning stratified and sometimes poisonous, acidified seas dissolving shells, forest collapsing under heat, acid rain, and fire. Ozone damage and toxins as extra kicks while everything is already down. Case closed, right? Not quite. Because when you start lining up all the evidence, zooming in on the timing, and trying to match specific kill mechanisms to specific victims, the story stops being a tidy crime drama and starts looking more like a stack of overlapping disaster movies. The closest thing we have to a best fit scenario goes something like this. First, the Siberian traps switch on in a big way. Over something like 1 million years, maybe with particularly intense pulses over a few 100,000, basalt floods out over what's now northern Asia. Magma intrudes into thick piles of coal, evaporates, and organic-rich sediments, cooking them, releasing extra CO2, methane, sulfur gases, halogens, and a cocktail of metals. Atmospheric CO2 spikes. Global temperatures rise by several degrees, maybe into the double-digit range. Polar ice, what little is left from earlier in the Permian, disappears. Temperature gradients flatten. Weather patterns get weird and extreme. On land, that means heat waves, droughts, and then violent storms. In the oceans, it means weaker circulation and warmer surface waters, a setup for oxygen loss. As the greenhouse intensifies, the surface ocean starts to stratify. The deep waters stop mixing efficiently with the surface. Oxygen that's used up at depth by respiration and decay isn't replenished fast enough. Anoxia spreads, first in restricted basins and along some continental margins, then more widely. In some places, it doesn't stop at no oxygen. Sulfate-reducing bacteria thrive in these dark, stagnant waters, pumping out hydrogen sulfide. Pockets of euxenia, toxic sulfidic water, expand up the water column, sometimes brushing into the sunlit zone. Add to that ongoing acidification. The same CO2 driving greenhouse warming dissolves into seawater, lowering pH. Carbonate shells become harder to build, easier to dissolve. Reef builders and many planktonic organisms get hit from both sides, corrosive water and suffocating conditions. Meanwhile, volcanic halogens and sulfur gases may be chewing at the ozone layer. UVB at the surface increases. Plants, plankton, and anything with delicate developmental stages out in the open air or sunlit ocean gets stressed. Mercury and other metals released from magma-sediment interactions add another layer of toxicity. Stack all of that together, and the integrated model looks like this. A volcanism-driven climate shock destabilizes the carbon cycle, warms the planet, strips oxygen from the sea, makes the oceans acidic and sometimes poisonous, hammers land plants with heat, acid rain, and UV damage, and contaminates ecosystems with metals and other toxins. Food webs, already strained, collapse in waves. From a distance, this picture fits a lot of the data remarkably well. Carbon isotopes show a giant, rapid negative excursion, consistent with a massive injection of light carbon from volcanic CO2 and possibly methane. Oxygen proxies, sedimentary structures, and specific biomarkers line up with widespread anoxia and episodes of euxenia. Boron isotopes and shell dissolution textures point to acidification. Plant fossils and pollen grains show stress morphologies. The coal gap and the sediment pulses on land line up with deforestation and erosion. Mercury spikes appear in multiple boundary sections worldwide. You can draw a line through all of that, and it looks like one coherent story. But zoom in, and three big problems jump out. First, the order of operations. Did warming ramp up first, slowly thinning ecosystems until a final pulse pushed them over the edge? Or did some kill mechanisms, like sudden, intense anoxia, strike almost abruptly near the boundary while forests and reefs were already teetering? In some marine sections, the main extinction horizon looks tightly focused, a thin bed or two where diversity plunges, right as geochemical proxies for anoxia and carbon cycle disruption go wild. In others, losses seem more spread out, with certain groups declining earlier, before the most obvious anoxic signals appear. On land, the timing is even fuzzier. Some basins suggest herbivores and predators vanish almost in sync with the marine crash. Others hint at a drawn-out decline tied to earlier aridification and habitat fragmentation. We know the Siberian traps were active before, during, and after the extinction. We know climate was already trending warmer in the late Permian, but tying specific volcanic pulses to specific extinction phases at a resolution of thousands of years, or even tens of thousands, is brutally hard. Radiometric dating can get us close, but close might still be 100,000 years margin of error. In a catastrophe that unfolded over, say, 60,000 to 200,000 years, that's a big blur. Second, regional differences. The End-Permian was global, but it wasn't uniform. Some shallow marine environments seemed to crash almost instantly, with brachiopods, corals, and foraminifera wiped out in a single stratigraphic step. Other areas, maybe deeper shelves, maybe high-latitude settings, show more staggered losses, or survival of certain groups into strata that are clearly post-extinction elsewhere. In a few regions there are hints of brief, local recoveries, small rebounds in diversity, even while the broader planet is still in crisis mode. On land, the same climate shift that makes the interior of Pangaea into an oven might make coastal or upland regions temporarily more hospitable, at least until global drivers catch up. Some plant communities may actually have benefited for a time from higher CO2, growing faster in marginal environments before everything tips into chaos. A single, simple kill mechanism doesn't capture that patchiness. Oxygen loss in the oceans would hit basins with different sensitivities at different times. Acidification would bite harder in certain chemistries and circulation setups. Halogen-driven ozone depletion might have uneven geographic effects. Even volcanic fallout patterns depend on wind belts, and storm tracks we can only roughly reconstruct. So when we see slightly different extinction timings in South China versus the Middle East versus high-latitude Gondwana, are we looking at real ecological differences in how the catastrophe unfolded, or are we being fooled by the rock record? Which brings us to the third problem, the record itself. Our entire reconstruction depends on scattered, incomplete, and heavily altered archives. Sedimentary rocks that span the Permian-Triassic boundary have been compacted, heated, chemically overprinted, faulted, eroded, and sometimes metamorphosed. Organic molecules degrade. Original mineral textures dissolve or recrystallize. Isotopic signals can be reset or smeared. That's diagenesis, the slow post-burial modification of rocks. It can blur sharp events into gradual trends, or in rare cases make gradual trends look sharper than they really were. Add sampling bias, sampling. We have spectacular high-resolution records from certain basins, classic Chinese sections, some in the Middle East, a handful in Europe, Russia and elsewhere. But vast parts of Pangaea's surface from 252 million years ago either left no preserved sediments at all or left rocks we haven't studied in detail yet. Marine shelves that were perfect archives may have been subducted. Continental deposits are often patchy and discontinuous. If your best sections all come from environments that were particularly vulnerable to, say, anoxia, you might overestimate how sudden and universal that anoxia was. If your terrestrial fossil sites mostly sample low-lying basins prone to flooding and erosion, you might misinterpret local habitat collapse as an instantaneous global event. Even within a single basin, the apparent order of signals can shift depending on where you sample. One core might show the mercury spike first, then the carbon excursion, then the extinction horizon. Another, a few kilometers away, might stack those slightly differently because of a local sedimentation quirks. This is why different datasets can seem to disagree, not because one is wrong, but because each is giving you a slightly different slice through a very messy three-dimensional catastrophe. Then there's the recovery problem. Even if you accept that the integrated volcano warming anoxia acidification ozone toxin model broadly explains the kill phase, it doesn't automatically explain what came after. Why did the early Triassic stay so bleak for so long? We're talking on the order of 5 to 10 million years where ecosystem, especially on land and in shallow seas, are low diversity, unstable and dominated by a few hardy disaster taxa. Carbon isotopes show repeated weird swings, suggesting the carbon cycle never really settled down. Sediments continue to record episodes of anoxia and high temperatures. The coal gap persists. Forests don't bounce back to their former complexity. Several possibilities are on the table. One is simple persistence. The Siberian traps didn't just flip off after the extinction. Eruptions continued, maybe in pulses, keeping CO2 high and climates hot. As long as greenhouse forcing stays intense, oceans tend to stay stratified and mildly to severely anoxic. Land tends to stay erosion-prone and drought-stressed. That's not a backdrop where lush complex ecosystems can easily reassemble. Another is feedbacks. Once soils are stripped and nutrient cycles are broken, even a modest climate improvement might not be enough. Poor thin soils make plant regrowth slow. Sparse vegetation means more erosion, which further degrades soils and clogs rivers and coastal seas with sediment and nutrients. Those nutrient pulses fuel more microbial blooms and more anoxia. It's a self-reinforcing ecological trap. There's also the possibility of repeated secondary shocks. Some records hint at multiple smaller negative carbon isotope excursions in the early Triassic, maybe tied to additional carbon releases, from continued volcanism, from destabilized methane clathrates, from burning organic matter in those eroding landscapes. Each one would be a mini version of the main crisis, a fresh temperature spike, another push toward anoxia and acidification, another setback for struggling ecosystems. Why do some groups, like certain bivalves or a few synapsid lineages, manage to hold on and slowly expand while others don't return at all? Why do reefs take so long to re-establish? Why does it seem like the planet is stuck in an ecological rut until well into the Middle Triassic? We don't fully know, which is why, more than 250 million years later, we're still arguing about details that, if we could just see them clearly, might redraw the entire story. So what could finally sharpen the picture? Higher precision dating of both the Siberian traps and boundary sections would help lock in the timeline. Not just eruptions were happening, but exactly which pulses lined up with which extinction and recovery phases. Advances in uranium-lead and argon-argon techniques are already tightening those windows. More will come. New drill cores from underexplored basins, both marine and continental, could fill in geographic gaps, especially from parts of ancient Pangaea we barely sample today. Cores that cut cleanly across the boundary, with continuous minimally disturbed sediment, are like time-lapse films compared to the snapshot outcrops we usually work with. Better and more diverse biomarkers, molecular fossils of specific microbes, algae and plants, might let us track oxygen levels, UV stress, nutrient regimes, and even specific microbial blooms with much finer resolution. Paired with emerging tools like clumped isotopes for paleo temperatures, they could turn the fuzzy, "it got really hot" into a detailed temperature curve. We may also refine our understanding of ozone loss and UV stress by hunting for more subtle damage signatures in spores and pollen, and by better modelling how volcanic halogens interact with different atmospheric states. All of that, fed into next-generation climate biogeochemical models, could let us run more realistic simulations, virtual Permian-Triassic worlds where we test different eruption schedules, carbon releases, ocean circulation modes, and ecological responses, and see which combinations reproduce the patterns we actually see in the rocks. In the end, the Great Dying is probably not one villain, but an ensemble cast. Siberian volcanism lights the fuse. Greenhouse warming, ocean anoxia and eusonia, acidification, ozone damage, and toxins all take turns on stage. Land and sea feed back into each other. The kill is not a single punch, but a barrage. The mystery now is not whether that barrage happened. The scars are everywhere. But exactly how the blows fell, in what order, and why it took life so long to stand back up. And that matters, because the closer we get to understanding the worst thing Earth's biosphere has ever endured, the better we can read the warning labels on what we're doing to the planet today. We know the ending. Life survives, changes, and eventually thrives again in a very different form. What we're still piecing together is the middle, the precise choreography of collapse and recovery that turned one world into another. That's the part of the story we're still living with and still trying to learn from. So we end up with this, a planet that almost went silent, not because of a single cinematic blow, but because a whole chain of bad things lined up and wouldn't stop. Volcanoes tore open the crust in Siberia and poured lava for hundreds of thousands of years. Greenhouse gases flooded the atmosphere. The climate lurched into a new state. Oceans lost their breath, sometimes turned poisonous. Rain turned acidic. Soils washed away. Forests collapsed. Ozone thinned. UV spiked. Metals and halogens leaked into air and sea. No one of those by itself quite explains why 96% of marine species and most land species vanished. Together, they come close. That's the part we're fairly sure about now. The big outlines are solid. Enormous Siberian eruptions at the right time. A huge, rapid carbon isotope shift. Geochemical fingerprints of Anoxia and Euxenia in multiple oceans. Evidence of acidification in shells and in boron isotopes. Mercury spikes. Plant stress in pollen and leaves. A long, miserable recovery written in coal gaps and low-diversity fossil faunas. The broad story. Enormous volcanism drives climate and ocean catastrophe. Ecosystems unravel in waves. Recovery takes millions of years. Fits a huge amount of evidence from all over the world. But inside that story, the mystery never really went away. It just got sharper. We still don't know the exact order of every blow. Did deep-water anoxia creep up slowly and then suddenly spill onto the shelves? Or did near-instant suffocation in some basins catch ecosystems off guard, while others were already weakened by heat and drought? How much did halogen-driven ozone loss actually matter compared to CO2 and methane? Was there an impact adding a last shove, or just coincidence in the craters we've found so far? We don't know why some corners of the planet hung on a little longer, why some lineages threaded the needle while others, just as successful for tens of millions of years, vanished in a single geological heartbeat. We don't know exactly why the early Triassic stayed locked in that grim, low-oxygen, erosion-choked state for so long when the worst of the eruptions may already have passed. And maybe the deepest question of all, how close did Earth really come to tipping into something even more hostile, some true runaway that a complex biosphere couldn't come back from? Did we skirt a hard edge in the climate-ocean system, or was there still a long way to fall? We're used to thinking of mass extinctions as endings. But walk the timeline forward a little, and the Great Dying looks more like a brutal reset. The forests that grew back in the Middle Triassic weren't the same as the coal swamp jungles of the late Permian. The reefs that eventually reappeared were built by different architects. On land, strange new reptile groups and the first true dinosaurs began to take over the empty niches. In the seas, survivors and opportunists slowly assembled new food webs in overheated low-oxygen waters. The world that emerged on the other side was recognizably Earth. But it wasn't the Permian anymore. It was a new planet with new rules built on the bones of the old one. If there's a warning label hidden in that story, it's not volcanoes are bad or CO2 is dangerous in isolation. It's that when you push multiple parts of the Earth system at once, climate, oceans, chemistry, ecosystems, the responses aren't gentle or predictable. They're lumpy. They're full of thresholds and feedbacks. And once you cross some of those thresholds, getting back is slow, messy, and sometimes impossible on any timescale that matters to living things. We are very clearly not living in the Permian. Our climate, our continents, our ocean circulation, even our sun are different. But we're doing something the rocks recognize, injecting carbon into the atmosphere and ocean very fast, heating the planet, stressing ecosystems that evolved under much more stable conditions. The End-Permian isn't a prophecy, it's a case study in what happens when the biosphere is forced into an experiment it didn't ask for. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who can help keep that story in circulation, so others can think about it, argue with it, and maybe learn from it. If you found this dive into the worst day in Earth's history thought-provoking, please tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and I'd love to hear from you personally. Tell me where you're listening from, city, country, maybe even what time it is for you right now. One of the strange comforts in talking about ancient global disasters is remembering that we're a global audience too, scattered across the planet comparing notes. If you enjoy falling asleep to deep time mysteries and planetary puzzles, you might also like the book I've put together about prehistoric secrets and forgotten worlds. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. 252 million years ago, Earth almost lost its voice. It took millions of years for the planet to find a new one. We're still learning to read that ancient record, and to decide what kind of chapter we want to write next.